It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, the Conservative MP Conor Burns, the Labour MP Emma Lewell-Buck, former Conservative Cabinet Minister and now a Senior Fellow at Yale, Rory Stewart, and Politico's UK political editor, Jack Blanchard. Today, will the double jabbed be given more freedom and be allowed to skip self-isolation?
It's something that I want to see, and we will introduce, subject to clinical advice, as soon as it's reasonable to do so.
Did this cost the Tories the seat of Chesham and Amersham?
What we will see is not more homes, but we will potentially see the wrong homes being built in the wrong places.
Our policy very often was frankly mischaracterised. At no time has this proposal been about suddenly indiscriminately bricking over the countryside.
The Blue Wall loses a brick, but does one by-election tell a trend?
I think there will be dozens of Conservative MPs looking over their shoulder now at the Liberal Democrat threat.
We'll ask this Conservative MP if he's one of them. Let's start the programme with a story you heard in the headlines by showing you the Daily Mail front page. New two-jab hope to free up your summer. So should double jabs give you more freedom? That's my opening question to our guest today. Conor?
Yes, of course they should. We've been told that vaccination was the route to freedom. If the vaccines work, and the evidence is they do, we should use the success of the vaccine, which has been, the rollout has been formidable, to get our economy and our lives back on track.
Emma, what do you think? Tony Blair, former Labour Prime Minister, talked recently about having more benefits if you've been fully vaccinated. Can we justify treating people differently?
I think everyone should have more freedom. The votes last week in Parliament in relation to extending the current measures, I voted against them because I don't think the government's current response is proportionate to where we are in the virus right now. OK.
And what about you, Rory?
I think that the whole world is moving that direction. You can see, for example, Israel is letting people behave in different ways in travelling if they have double vaccines. Where I've been teaching in the United States now, if you're double vaccinated, you have much more freedom. The Centre for Disease Control in the US allows you not to mask in shops, etc. And I think Britain should be following that example.
Right, so you don't see any problem with potential discrimination?
There is, of course, and that's something that people have talked about in and out for a long time. But I think in the end, it makes sense to say that if you're vaccinated, and we have very good reason now to believe that that gives a very good level of protection, both for yourself and in terms of transmitting it to others, then we should be realistic about allowing people who are vaccinated to have more freedoms.
Jack, where is the government exactly on this? They're certainly talking about it. We heard from the Health Secretary earlier today saying, once again, there's a pilot going on at the moment and we will do it as soon as possible. When do you think it might actually happen?
Well, when they get the data back, to be frank, where they can be sure that this is safe to do. And of course, there are different degrees of doing it, Joe. There are different freedoms you could give to people who are double vaccinated. What they're talking about at the moment is limiting how much you have to isolate if you've come into contact with someone who's got COVID. Well, that's pretty different to telling people they can go on holiday and come back and not have to quarantine. And I think the danger for the government is if they do this quickly, there's a lot of people in this country who haven't had the chance to be double vaccinated yet. So if you're saying, yes, older people, you can go on holiday and not quarantine, younger people, you can't, that becomes problematic if those younger people haven't even been given the opportunity yet to be double vaccinated.
Right. Do you see that as a problem too, Conor?
I totally see that point. I see the discrimination point when people have not had the opportunity to have had both jabs. I think the discrimination point pales when people have been offered the opportunity to have both jabs and have chosen, for whatever reason, not to. The minority who choose not to cannot curtail and hold back the freedom of the majority.
All right, let me show you this headline. We're going to talk about the story on the front page of the Daily Express. It's also on the front page of a couple of the other newspapers. That's anger at triple lock pension threat. The triple lock, of course, was a manifesto commitment by the Conservatives in 2019. It guarantees that state pensions rise by either average earnings, inflation or 2.5%, whichever is the highest. And it's reported plans to ditch the triple lock to help pay for COVID recovery. It's also here on the Telegraph front page where it says pensions raid to pay for the pandemic. So, as I say, lots of reports on this. Boris Johnson's been asked about it this morning. He says he doesn't recognise these reports, but in principle, Conor, should the government honour the triple lock on pensions?
I think this is a debate that is welcome, that how we discuss how we pay for what has been the most incredible loosening of the public finances. If we have, rather like the international aid commitment, if we have a fundamentally unforeseen event that knocks the public finances, and the income bounces back massively because of the pandemic in 1 year, is it right that the pensions go up by that 6 or 8%? Probably not.
Right. Rory, what do you think? It will mean, as you've just heard there from Conor, a 6% increase if the triple lock remains. Does that really make sense, given how many people have taken a hit financially during the pandemic?
What I'm about to say is an easy thing for me to say now that I'm a professor, not a working politician. But the fact is that we're in a real mess now in Britain. And there are only three ways of dealing with the problem. The problem, of course, is that we're having to borrow an incredible amount of money to deal with the pandemic. And there are only three things you can do. You can borrow more, you can spend more, or you can cut spending. Sorry, you can borrow more, you can cut spending, or you can tax people more. And I don't think we can borrow anymore. We're in real danger of inflation. I think there's not much demand now for cuts. There's a government that's very much turned against austerity. So the government's going to have to find money somewhere. And I think, sadly, things like pensions and definitely increases in corporation tax are going to have to come along.
Right. Emma, do you agree that the government just can't borrow more?
Well, I think here we are again, the government once again breaking a manifesto commitment. You know, the recent rich list that came out, there's 171 billionaires, the biggest rise in 33 years in this country. Why aren't we not looking at taxing them and their companies? Why are we raiding people's pensions?
Conor, it is a manifesto commitment.
It's a manifesto commitment, but the pandemic was absolutely unforeseen. And I just pose the question, why should those who have their incomes guaranteed, pensioners, benefit to the tune of 6% because of the anomaly of the bounce back? I welcome the debate, because at last we're talking about how we balance the public finances again, rather than just how we spend more of taxpayers' money.
But there's money elsewhere, as I've just stated, so why go after pensioners? Why break another manifesto commitment?
It's not about going after pensioners. We can increase it by the cost of living. We can make sure pensioners are protected. This is an anomaly that we are seeing a huge rise in wages, bounce back from the pandemic. It is an anomaly, potentially, that pensioners could benefit to the tune of 6% when the public finances, working people, working taxpayers cannot afford that.
In 33 years.
Emma, you know that we could confiscate all the money of the billionaires and it would be a rounding error in the public finances. That's just envy politics, I'm afraid. Jeremy Corbyn's gone. Jeremy Corbyn's gone, Emma.
It's not envy politics.
Emma, Keir Starmer has said Britain isn't working for working families. So should pensioners receive more at the expense of others?
Well, I think it's a manifesto commitment. It was one of our manifesto commitments as well, to keep the triple lock on pensions. I'm not prepared to go back on any of our manifesto commitments. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I've just stated 3 times there's money elsewhere. There's people who can't afford to shoulder some of this. We're coming out of a pandemic. Lots of people have made a lot of money through this pandemic. That surely should be shared equitably across the country.
The richest are paying more income tax than they ever did under any previous Labour government.
And they're richer than they ever were before.
Is there a breach of trust, though, with voters?
Look, I was out knocking on doors in my own constituency this weekend. I think the public understand that what we've been through is absolutely unprecedented, and the government needs to respond due to the unprecedented nature of what we're facing.
Rory, you wanted to come in.
Yep. I just want to come in and say that the most important thing, whatever the government chooses to do, is to understand that there are some there are pensioners who are in very difficult financial situations. So the key thing is to understand there are, of course, wealthy pensioners, and we hear a lot about wealthy pensioners, and you know, there are many people who can deal with this. What we need is a government system that's much better at picking up at poverty amongst the elderly, and that would then make the transition easier. I think many people would accept what Conor's saying, which is that you go up in line with inflation, provided you have the measures in place to protect the people who are genuinely vulnerable.
Right. I mean, Jack, is there a shift going on here? Because there was a time, certainly during this pandemic, when Conservative backbenchers were urging the government to spend and continue to spend big. It feels as though there's been a change. You listen to what Rory is saying and Connor, and now they're asking the government to pull back. What are the politics of this?
Yeah, well, there has been a massive change, and that, of course, is the vaccine programme, which means hopefully this pandemic is coming to an end. And so minds are now turning to how on earth we pay for what we've just done over the last 18 months, what we had to do over the last 18 months in terms of freezing the economy and supporting people through it. I think the politics are honestly that I think there probably is some appetite for doing something on pensions, simply because we've asked young people and working people to make massive sacrifices over the past 18 months, largely broadly to protect older people, and absolutely rightly so. But I think the politics of that mean that if the government was then to turn around and say we are going to have to ask pensioners to do something we wouldn't otherwise have asked them to do, I think broadly there might be support for that here. But it's a case of how you'd go about it,
right,
and who is impacted by it.
Do you agree with that point, though, about younger people having to pay the price and shoulder some of the future expectations on payments for the recovery?
I think there's this myth that pensioners are all absolutely loaded and, you know, going on holidays and have yachts and big houses and all the rest of it. They don't. Pensioners in my constituency
have yachts as well.
Pensioners in my constituency are going to food banks. They are struggling to pay their bills. They are not wealthy people. I think it should be shared out equitably. It should be fair across the board.
Well, and also, Rory, you know, we are in a sort of wartime setting. Interest rates are still low. I mean, the Conservatives' fiscal rules were never going to be maintained in this sort of situation, were they?
Well, I think the real problem is that the government's taken to making more and more spending commitments. I mean, as somebody who obviously was a Conservative, I begin to feel as though in terms of spending, I'm more to the right of Boris Johnson, because I cannot understand the amount of spending that's going on things like aircraft carriers and other commitments. I don't really understand where the money's supposed to be coming from these great promises that he made at the G7 to do things like setting up a Marshall Fund for international climate. So I think the government is going to have to be much, much more careful. We are very short of cash. We've got an aging population. The public finances have always been very tight in Britain. And the only way we're going to come through this is, yes, there's going to have to be some raise in taxes. Yes, you're right, there may have to be some impact on pensioners. But the government's also got to get into the habit of stopping making unfunded spending commitments.
Right. I mean, has Boris lost control, Boris Johnson, when it comes to promising to spend money on all sorts of things, from aircraft carriers to royal yachts, for example?
No, I think it's fair to say that the Prime Minister, who I actively supported to become Prime Minister, is in a different tradition to a Thatcherite Conservative. He believes in the power of an enabling state. But I think this is a very welcome debate that we've commenced again, remembering that government doesn't have any money, it only has the people's money, and a legitimate debate about what is the role of the state and what is rightly left to individuals and private enterprise.
Right. What balance do you think it should be?
I welcome the debate. I think, look, the government is incredibly popular at the moment.
You're being a little coy here, aren't you, Connor? Rory?
Connor, you're more on the Thatcherite side, aren't you?
Yes.
Well, I was an energetic Rory, as you know. You and I were in the meeting room together with the Prime Minister when you came in. You know I'm an enthusiastic supporter of the Prime Minister because I believe he is a politician who can communicate with the public like no one else in contemporary politics. Right.
Rory, do you think there's been a big about change there for Connor?
Well, something. I mean, Connor is also, without putting too much on Connor, was also, I remember being a very, very strong supporter of Margaret Thatcher and of that approach to politics. So there's something very interesting happening in the Conservative Party. Let's take it away from Connor into the bigger issue, which is there is a debate going on between people who believe in spending more and people who think that we need to be more careful around the public finances. And I think Boris Johnson, who is a very ebullient figure, has recently, over the last few weeks, and we can see this played through in this debate going on with Rishi Sunak all over the front page of Sunday Times, is beginning to make spending commitments that don't seem to have been passed off by the Treasury. And we need to be a bit careful about that.
Have you abandoned your Thatcherite principles then, Connor?
Not at all. And I remember that the Prime Minister, like Mrs Thatcher, is the First Lord of the Treasury.
That's true. Jack, there was an expectation that the Prime Minister would be holding a meeting on the future of social care tomorrow. It appears that's no longer the case. He also made a promise, of course, to deal with social care, to have a plan, and we still haven't had it.
Yeah, not just a promise to deal with it. He said he did have a plan. He told us it was ready to go when he became Prime Minister. And that, of course, was now nearly 2 years ago. Now, yes, obviously, there's been a massive once-in-a-century pandemic happen between them. But it's pretty clear that when he told us he didn't have a plan, well, he had a plan, he did not have a plan, because otherwise, where is it? Why would they still be arguing about it? And I think it's another of these big structural issues that the government has been avoiding dealing with for the best part of 10, probably 15 years, maybe longer now. And, you know, you could argue that coming out of a pandemic is a good time to finally grasp this, because we've seen how important the interlock between NHS and social care services are, but equally it's a time when the country is absolutely strapped for cash, as we've been talking about. And how we deal with this problem, it is going to be very costly.
Right, what would you like to see, Conor?
Words that you wouldn't imagine normally coming out of my mouth. I'd like to see a cross-party consensus on this. We saw how difficult this was in 2017 when Mrs May made some announcements and it was politicised and frightened people terribly. We've got to get this onto a long-term sustainable problem. This is a national problem, a national challenge.
Conor, we've been talking about this for over a decade.
Yes, we have.
And the Prime Minister, as Jack has said, promised a plan. A cross-party consensus sounds like it'll be another decade before there is some sort of policy on social care.
The problem is we're going to need to involve the private sector to some degree in this, and we're going to need them to have the certainty that that won't change when inevitably there will be a change in government at some point.
Right, just briefly, Emma, you know how difficult it is. Gordon Brown suffered in the election in 2010 as a result of a policy that he would say was mischaracterised as a death tax when it came to social care. And we saw what happened with Theresa May in the election in 2017. These are very difficult issues, aren't they?
They are, and politicians can't keep kicking the can down the road. We have called for cross-party consensus for a long time now, and that's been consistently rejected by the Tory party. Once again, what we're seeing here is Boris Johnson. He's big on rhetoric, but when it comes to delivery, there's nothing there.
All right, we're going to talk about the situation in Northern Ireland with my colleague, BBC correspondent, political correspondent there, Jane McCormack. Jane, it wasn't very long ago that the DUP announced a new leader in Edwin Poots, and he nominated a new First Minister to replace Arlene Foster, and they agreed a deal with Sinn Féin. All that's changed. What's happening?
It's been a pretty dramatic few days here in Northern Ireland, Jo, and it looks like Sir Geoffrey Donaldson is now on course to become the party's third leader within a matter of months, just days after Edwin Poots dramatically resigned, having lost the support of practically all his MPs and MLAs. Now, we know that this nominations process for leader is open until tomorrow. We haven't heard from Sir Geoffrey yet as to whether or not he is going to stand, but I think all party sources have been telling me that it's pretty likely he will run this time, and he probably will secure it, because remember, just a month ago, he only lost the leadership by 2 votes to Edwin Poots. I think there is a sense within the party that, given the internal divisions that have spilled into public view over the past few weeks and the problems that have been emerging, they would like to try and get this nipped in the bud as quickly as they can. So it's likely to be a coronation rather than a contest for Sir Geoffrey. And I think eyes in Westminster will be watching as well, because he is a very familiar face over there. He's been an MP since 1997. He is the DUP's Westminster leader. He's well regarded by many within government as well. And what we're told is that when he does become leader, if he does, but it looks likely at this moment, his immediate focus will be on tackling the Brexit protocol, because he says there must be changes to it. Otherwise, he could threaten to take the DUP out of the power-sharing executive at Stormont and potentially trigger another collapse there. And I think there will be many within government watching now to see the dynamic of Sir Geoffrey's possible leadership and how that changes things there.
Right, so could we see another election then?
Anything could happen in Northern Ireland at the moment, I
Indeed.
think it's fair to say. At this stage, the next Assembly election isn't due until May 2022, but there are reasons why it could happen earlier. You talked about Paul Givan. He was only appointed as First Minister last week by Edwin Poots whenever Arlene Foster stood down. He has been told by the DUP that once Sir Geoffrey becomes DUP leader, then Paul Givan will have to stand down, because Sir Geoffrey wants to be First Minister as well. Now, once Paul Givan does stand down, then there becomes a problem there, because that triggers a 7-day countdown whereby both the DUP and Sinn Féin have to renominate a First and Deputy First Minister. And if one of those parties refuses, then at the end of that 7-day period, then the Northern Ireland Secretary Brandon Lewis has to step in and set a date for a fresh election. It's complicated, you can see where I'm going with this, but if for some reason Sir Geoffrey then decides he doesn't want to nominate somebody as First Minister, maybe in terms of talks around the protocol or potential maybe more focused on the Irish language, well then that's where it gets pretty tricky. There's also the added complication, Jo, that Geoffrey Donaldson has to actually get back from Westminster to Stormont. He would have to give up his seat in the Commons and be co-opted back into the Assembly. That would trigger a by-election in the Lagan Valley constituency. The last time he won that seat a couple of years ago, he lost, he basically cut his majority in half, and Alliance, the cross-community party here, were snapping at his heels. So that's a factor as well. I think it's fair to say at the moment in Northern Ireland, none of the parties would want another election this soon, but I think often it's the law of unintended consequences in Northern Ireland that tends to play out, and in this case that certainly could apply to an early election.
Well, as you say, it's all very precarious. No doubt we will be talking about this very soon. Jane in Belfast, thank you very much for joining us. Now we're going to discuss the fallout from the Chesham and Amersham by-election. The Lib Dems won a pretty stunning victory from the Conservatives, and planning reform was cited as an issue on the doorstep. Nervous Tory backbenchers trying to force the government to rethink its upcoming planning bill, which will make it easier broadly for developers to secure planning permission for new housing. Let's just show you the headline here in the Daily Mirror. Tories pile pressure on Boris Johnson over planning shake-up that sparked embarrassing defeat. Now, this afternoon, Labour has an opposition day debate on the issue. Labour Shadow Communities Secretary Steve Reid will call on the government to give communities greater oversight of planning applications with a non-binding vote to follow. Conor, do you, like so many of your colleagues, have concerns about the planning bill?
Well, look, firstly, let's just a moment on Chesham and Amersham. I was there a lot. The candidate, Peter Fleet, brilliant former Ford executive, is a friend of mine for 30 years standing. It came up on the doorstep quite a lot. So did HS2. And the Liberal Democrat pitch was very straightforward, very sensible, very poignant. It said this vote doesn't make any difference to the government's majority. It doesn't imperil the government. You have a free hit. Use it to send a message. And there is no doubt that planning was part of that, as was HS2.
Right, so you do understand your colleagues' concerns?
I understand my colleagues' concerns, and it was suboptimal that some of my colleagues were quoted on Liberal Democrat leaflets. But the reality is the Conservative Party is the party that believes in a property-owning democracy. And we've now reached the point where people born between the early 1980s and 2000s have half as likely a chance of owning a home as those born in the 40s to the 60s. And we've got to address that. And part of that is housing supply. And I think the planning bill, which is in consultation at the moment, is an opportunity to speed up the planning process and to counter Theresa May, to get the right homes built in the right places and afford young people the opportunity to get their foot on the property ladder.
Right, so would you be happy to see your face on the front of a campaigning leaflet defending this policy in an election?
I would be very happy to support a policy that allows young people the opportunity that those who've gone before them took for granted to own a home in Britain today.
Right, but just to quote a few of your colleagues, we had Bob Seeley, MP, saying that the government's planning free-for-all is electorally toxic and must be abandoned. I can show you this in the Daily Telegraph. Theresa Villiers, former Environment Secretary, Boris Johnson must cut housing targets for the overcrowded South after by-election defeat. And we heard former Prime Minister Theresa May saying the same thing. Are you concerned that this is going to lose you support from previously safe Tory seats?
I am concerned about that, and I'm concerned that the government could do better on the communication of what it's trying to do and bring communities with them, because my reading of the bill is that it allows local authorities the opportunity to have a local plan. At the moment, over half of local authorities don't even have a local plan. So the system we have at the moment, Jo, is a developer's charter, a big developer's charter. And this bill, if it's approached correctly, is the opportunity to empower local communities, to bring them with them, to improve the quality of the housing stock that is delivered. And as I say, crucially, give young people the opportunity to fulfil their dream of owning their own home.
Well, you'd support that, wouldn't you? I mean, there is a housing crisis, isn't there, Emma? You said you stand by the 2019 Labour manifesto. You pledged to build 150,000 affordable homes over 5 years, with 1 million homes built over a decade. You need to simplify the process, not slow it down with consultations.
Well, what this legislation's actually doing, though, is It's opening up the countryside. It's open season to develop on the green belt. It's got nothing to do with building extra homes. Local councils at the moment, I think it's 9 in 10 of every applications to build housing they grant. The developers aren't building. So let councils build social housing. Why farm it out to the private sector? Why allow people to build all over our green belt? That's what this does. And it disempowers and disenfranchises local communities because you're taking away their right to object to any of this at the same time. It's no coincidence that since Boris Johnson came to power, £11 million by developers has been donated to the Tory party. I
didn't want to cut across you, Emma, but I mean, it is just simply not correct to say that this facilitates development on the green belt. This, in fact, enhances the protections.
The Tory-led LGA disagrees with you.
It enhances the protections on the green belt, which was a manifesto commitment on our part to protect the green belt. It prioritises brownfield development, and it empowers local communities to decide what they want by speeding up the process for local authorities to adopt a local plan. When a local authority doesn't have a local plan, they are victim then to developers' appeal over their head to the planning inspectorate, which seems to grant lots of the wrong permissions in the wrong places.
Right, but I mean, it's not just Emma. As I said, I've read from your colleagues. Has everyone else mischaracterised the policy then?
Look, I'm conceding that I think we've got to do a much better job in getting across what it is we're trying to do and bring local communities and parliamentary colleagues with us in that. It is clear, and I think, by the way, if the Chesham and Amersham by-election achieve one thing, it certainly won't be the Lib Dems candidate's pledge that she's now going to stop HS2 as her first act, a very bold, courageous pledge, if I may say so, but it's certainly going to force us to have a conversation around how we approach planning and the communications of what we're trying to do.
Rory, what's your view on this? I mean, can you understand lots of sort of comfortable, affluent, middle-class people who want views of the countryside and they don't want to lose that?
No, fundamentally, Britain is now one of the most densely populated places on Earth, more densely populated than India, particularly southeast England. And there is less and less countryside left. And that's been going on since the 1970s. So what the government is doing here is struggling with an impossible problem. And the only solution to this is to really change the way we approach cities. We need to build medium density in cities. It's a horrible thing going on. Either there are skyscrapers being built, 30-story things, or there is a sprawl right the way across the countryside. Actually, what we should be doing is building 6 to 8-story mansion blocks, very popular in some of the fanciest bits of London. Chelsea and places like that are full of them. And that is the way in which grown-up cities all over the world deal with an expanding population. And we need to do this. We must stop this sprawl.
Emma, would that be your vision for cities and the countryside?
I think you need to take local communities with you. Whatever you're doing, you need to take that community with you. And this proposed legislation completely blocks out community voices.
But isn't there a risk, though? Isn't the risk there of not in my backyard, the NIMBYism, that if you leave it just to local communities, they'll block house building?
Well, no, because you've also got local councils who help make decisions alongside their communities. And people are crying out for social housing in my patch and in other parts of the country. So why would they block that? This isn't about NIMBYism. This is about it being fair and not favouring private developers over those who actually need those homes.
But it isn't just about social housing, is it? It's about homes in general. I mean, Jack, it's interesting that there's been so much discussion about this and it came up on the doorstep in Chesham and Amersham because we haven't actually seen the details, really, have we? The fine details of this bill.
Well, that's right. It's not often a government white paper stirs people up this much, but planning is a massively contentious issue in this country, as we're just seeing from this debate. What I would say is that, it wasn't that long ago that the last Tory government under David Cameron did massive planning reform. They were promising it to be the biggest shake-up in however many decades. It was going to transform house building. And there was a huge amount of heartache and a lot of rows. And eventually the planning reform went through. And here we are a few years later having the same debate again. So there has to be a question mark about the extent to which you can address our housing shortage purely through planning reform, because we've tried that already. And evidently it didn't work because we're back here again. So I think there are different ways you can approach this. And planning is probably only one of them, but it's the one that this government is particularly keen to talk about.
Rory?
I think we have huge opportunities, for example, in places like London, to build social housing owned by London and kept for the people of London into the future and genuinely affordable. There's thousands of acres of TfL land, transport land in general, which could become available. Instead of putting that into commercial developers, that's where you build high quality, medium rise housing and you keep ownership of it and you put people into it. We need to return to the idea of properly run housing built by the government for people who need affordable housing, because what we talk about as being affordable around London simply isn't affordable at all.
Well, as you say, it's got to be truly affordable. Rory, of course, Connor, was an independent candidate for Mayor of London, so has obviously done some work on this. Do you agree with what he's just outlined?
I actually agree with many things that Rory says. Rory and I would have been on different wings of the Conservative Party, but Rory is a very sensible, shrewd and deep thinker. And I think there's a lot in that. I think also, by the way, it's important that it's part of the government's levelling up agenda. This debate is far too focused on London and the South East. We've got to give people the opportunity to stay in the communities outside London and the South East, have homes and jobs and opportunities there as well. We've got to take the pressure off London and the South East. Right,
Jack, the debate this afternoon, obviously Labour are cleverly trying to exploit those divisions emerging on Tory backbenches. Do you think any Tory MPs will actually vote with Labour in this Opposition Day debate, however strong they're feeling on it?
I'm not sure if they will, because at the end of the day, this is not a binding vote. It doesn't really mean anything. What Labour is doing is helpfully giving the Conservative backbenchers the opportunity to voice their concerns in Parliament to the government and facilitating that. This is a precursor to what's to come when we do finally see the details of this bill, which I suspect might be rather later in the year than the government had originally planned, given how contentious it's clearly going to be. I think the other thing that we haven't talked about is incentives. I think one way that the government ought to be thinking about this is if you want to take communities with you in terms of building new housing, there are things you can do around incentives in terms of saying, look, you build the new housing, that means you're going to get a new playground, a new community centre. Those kinds of things can, take people with you, as people have been saying, and that doesn't seem to be something the government is keen to address either.
Right, Jack, I'm going to stick with you because as we're talking broadly about the Chesham and Amersham by-election, it was quite an extraordinary result. Yes, it was a by-election, but the Conservatives did have a huge majority of over 16,000 votes, and the Lib Dems have overturned that, and they've now got a healthy majority of 8,000 votes. How significant is it beyond by-elections?
Well, I think by-elections, as you're hinting at, do have a real history of throwing up shock results. And it comes back to something Connor said earlier, which is that people are smart enough to know that they are not electing the government that day. They're electing a local MP, and they can send a message to the government if they want to over issues they're not happy about. And clearly, in that part of the world, there are two very big ones at the moment, the new railway line being built smack through the middle of it, and this potential changes to planning laws. So I'm not convinced, to be honest, it's quite as big a deal as some of the more breathless reporting of it over the weekend has. Clearly something is happening in parts of what used to be very traditional Tory England, where people are a bit less sure about this Conservative government than they have been in the past. But whether this is part of some massive shift that's going to see great swathes of the South East turning socialist, I'm not totally sure.
What about you, Connor? Because you said you're worried about the messaging on things like planning reforms, but it's clear there is a lot of nervousness from Conservative MPs representing seats in southern England. You are one of them, of course. Do you think the Prime Minister is giving places like Bournemouth, your constituency, the attention they deserve? Or has it all been about the red wall, as we like to call it, those former Labour strongholds, and too much focus on levelling up there?
Look, I think there's been a narrative that has been created about levelling up meaning just the north. Levelling up means levelling up communities the length and breadth of the country.
They have been
and
focusing
for example,
on those newly won
in the
seats,
far southwest, Cornwall, where there's one of the poorest parts of the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister took the G7, G8 there recently. I think that was a symbol that he means levelling up to mean levelling up nationally and amongst communities. On the by-election, look, Lib Dems got 22,000. It's been written up as a huge shock wave. In the 80s, in Rydale, they got 28,000. In Christchurch in the 90s, they got 33,000.
Quite a long time ago.
But by-elections, but they were by-elections. And both of those seats, for example, came back at the next election. The electorate in Chesham and Amersham have got the one thing I think they wanted. They've got the government's attention. We are now going to be thinking about and talking about some of those issues that their vote, let's be honest, has provoked us to refocus on. Not to focus on, to refocus on.
All right, well, I mean, let's talk about what Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, actually said. He said his party stands to win dozens of Conservative seats in what he called the Blue Wall in the south of England. I'll just show you this map here, Conservative-held Lib Dem target seats. You can see Chesham and Amersham in Buckingham Buckinghamshire. It went blue to orange last week. Cluster of Conservative seats nearby, where the Lib Dems are currently a very close second. For example, in Wimbledon, which is number 1 on the list, the Conservative majority is just a few hundred votes. And in 7th place, you can see Esher and Walton. That is the seat of the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab. Now, of course, there are proposed boundary changes that could go through before the next election. Then this map, of course, would be redrawn. Now, I know the Lib Dems aren't second in your seat, but do you think there is a real threat electorally from the Liberal Democrats now you've just seen these seats graphically and how close they could be?
If I'm honest, no, I don't. Because we are in government, we have the opportunity to use government to show those communities what having a Conservative government means for them and for the communities that we as members of Parliament serve. What I saw in Cheshire and Amersham and dozens of visits there was the whole of the Lib Dem national machine descending on Cheshire and Amersham. They will not be able to do that across those so-called target seats. Look, I give Ed Davey his moment. His party is temporarily off life support and he must be hugely relieved. Fair play to him.
All right, Rory, what do you think? Is it the beginning of a Lib Dem revival coming at the expense of many Conservative MPs?
Well, we're definitely in a very strange stage in British politics because British politics went into a 2019 election with Jeremy Corbyn against Boris Johnson at its almost most polarised. And that means that there is a hole somewhere in the centre ground. And the problem for the Lib Dems has always been, can they or can they not fill that centre ground? I passionately believe that there is a space there where a lot of British voters want to be. And that's a space that's sensible, pragmatic, it's not ideological, tries to bring together people who voted Remain, people who voted Brexit instead of creating a war between them. It's something that could be generous on overseas aid, but could also be sensible and prudent in the way in which we spent money. Unfortunately, the Lib Dems have proved again and again over 40 years they're not very good at occupying that centre ground. But if they can get there, that is a very, very fruitful terrain to be in a world in which people, I think, will eventually get exhausted with this very polarised right-left politics.
Do you still see it as polarised, Emma, in that sense, on left and right, red and blue? Keir Starmer not going for the centre ground?
No, and just going back to this by-election that we're discussing, you know, Labour voters lent their vote to the Liberal Democrats in this. This was tactical voting. It wasn't something we asked them to do, but it's what they did. And, you know, the Lib Dems, it's been, since the coalition, they've had 3 general elections, and this is the first sign of the public ever forgiving them for going into coalition with the Tories.
Right. Is that how you would describe what John Curtis has said was Labour's worst ever result in a by-election? Is that what they did? They just gave all those Labour voters their votes to the Liberal Democrats?
I think they did. And, you know, John Curtis has also said that people in the south are turned off by all this talk of levelling up. And the problem we've got here is once the people in the north realise, and we already are quickly realising that this levelling up isn't going to deliver anything for us, it's turning us off as well. And the Tories are in big trouble here. Amanda Millen said that they're listening loud and clear.
Conservative Party chairman.
Yeah, I don't think Connor has been listening loud and clear.
Connor?
I think... Can I...
Yes,
sorry,
go on, Rory.
Connor comes in, I think there's a sort of another thing going on, which is party allegiance and loyalty in general is getting more fragile. People are much more liable to change their mind. When moving away from a country where people often voted the same way their parents, their grandparents did, this amazing change has happened in the United States, where famously, obviously, the Republicans have picked up the votes of the Democrats picked up the votes of Republicans. You can see something happening here in Britain too. Boris Johnson now picking up working class Labour seats in the north of England under pressure down in the south. All of this means that we're moving into very, very unpredictable territory. I don't think we can expect over the next 10, 20 years for things to look like they did in the 70s and 80s.
Right, well, you've mentioned shifting allegiances. Let me just show everybody this story in The Guardian. It was also covered at the weekend. John Bercow, former Speaker, defects to Labour with withering attack on Boris Johnson. Were you sorry, Connor, to see John Bercow join the Labour Party?
I'm sorry, Jo, I'm slightly unclear. When was that story 10, 12 years ago? Or is that a recent story?
OK, so maybe it wasn't a big leap, as you are obviously implying. So you weren't sorry
Look,
or surprised,
I
clearly.
remember when John I still regard as a friend. That's a minority sport now in the Conservative Parliamentary Party. But I remember when he was re-elected as Speaker and he said he had to leave his political allegiances behind him. And David Cameron said, that's something, Mr. Speaker, many of us thought you had done a long time ago. I regret, by the way, John broke a lot of conventions. I regret that he's breaking the convention that former speakers remain neutral for the rest of their lifetimes. I think that is a cherishable tradition that I'm sorry to see go.
What did you think of his description of the Conservative Party, or certainly this Conservative government, Rory? John Bercow said the party has become reactionary and xenophobic under its current leadership.
Look, it's not, the Conservative Party is not Donald Trump's party, but there are obviously things that I'm deeply disturbed by. It's one of the reasons I didn't support Boris Johnson and have left the party. I think there's a lot of things, though, going wrong in British politics. Connor's right that the Speaker should remain neutral. But I also think Boris Johnson should have put the Speaker into the House of Lords in the way that Speakers have been put in the past. I think people are beginning to play around with constitutional conventions in dangerous ways. We saw it with prorogation of Parliament. We see it in the way the judiciary is treated. Everybody needs to calm down. And I think
Rory, just on that, can we be very accurate on this, on the Lords, and one has to be very sensitive in what one says on this. But there is an ongoing inquiry into Mr. Bercow, and that was the impediment from the Appointments Commission for Mr. Bercow going to the House of Lords.
Right. Well, on that, do you welcome John Bercow into the Labour Party? Because Connor is quite right. He had faced bullying allegations in the past, which he denies, but he is reportedly still under investigation.
Well, we have a process in our party where anyone who joins the party, we do the relevant checks, and I think that's still going on as I speak.
Should that have happened before he joined the party?
I don't know if he is officially joined yet or not. I don't know. I'm in our membership team.
Well, he says he has joined them, so one assumes that he has been accepted. Anyway, as we talk about John Bercow, is he an asset then, do you think, to the Labour Party?
Well, yes, he knows a lot about politics. He was in politics in one of the most interesting and fraught times in my memory. So, yes, he's very welcome in our party and we're pleased he's there.
Right. Would you like to see him in the House of Lords?
He should have been put in the House of Lords. I think there's some dissatisfaction right across the country about that.
Right. I mean, Jack, this has been reported over the weekend. Perhaps Connor is right. It wasn't a huge surprise. It wasn't a very long journey, perhaps politically, for John Bercow, the former Speaker, to join the Labour Party.
No, well, I mean, we saw him taking, shall we say, stronger positions while he was Speaker of the Commons than you might have expected others to take. And he certainly made himself incredibly unpopular on the Tory benches where he used to sit. So I think there will be very few raised eyebrows over there at this announcement.
Right. And also on shifting allegiances, Rory, what's your relationship with the Conservative Party at the moment?
My own, I don't really have any relationship with the Conservative Party. I remain, broadly speaking, on the left of the Conservative Party. I'm a centrist person.
So you're still a member?
No, I'm not a member. No. I was thrown out of the Conservative Party.
So no longer a member. And would you ever join another party?
I think at the moment I'm pretty fed up with I'm ashamed to say, all these parties. And I think there's a big problem, which is that basically Britain is run by parties. It's very difficult to stand for Parliament, stand for a mayoral seat without a party behind you. And the party activists and the party officials in both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and even the Lib Dems produce a very, very strange outcome, of which the most dramatic was the 2019 election where you end up with Jeremy Corbyn against Boris Johnson. And I think if we're going to get back to sensible, thoughtful politics and high-quality politicians, we're going to have to think about the way in which the parties are behaving.
Right, Connor, what's your response to what you just heard?
Rory's welcome back any time. I was always disappointed that I couldn't land Rory to support the Boris Johnson leadership campaign. He's welcome back. He'd be an asset.
All right, in terms of pacts, though, could you see Labour working with the Liberal Democrats, Emma, on the basis of what you said, that Labour voters lent their votes to the Liberal Democrats? Is that something that should be considered?
I don't think so. I think once you throw your hat in with another party, you know, the example I gave earlier, that the coalition, it's took all this time for the Lib Dems to recover from that. Once you betray who you are in the naked pursuit of power, it takes a long time for people to trust you again.
Yes, but if you have a joint venture to kick out the Conservatives, wouldn't that be an advantage?
I don't think that would work, and I think there'd be a lot of people in both parties who wouldn't want to do that because the consequences later down the line could be that you're in the electoral wilderness for a very long time. You might win power for a short period of time, but after that you could be out in the cold for a long time. And I want us to win and win for a long time when we're in the next general election.
Jack, do you think there'll be more conversations about unofficial pacts, if not official ones, working together, not standing in seats where an opposing party could get rid of a Conservative candidate?
Well, it's something that's been talked about on the sort of liberal left of the politics in this country for decades, isn't it? But it's never really come to fruition. And Personally, I feel, I mean, you've just heard there from Emma that these parties are pretty tribal at the end of the day. They don't really, there's plenty of people on both sides who don't want to work with other parties. I also think if they didn't manage it during the last election, when the whole thing was about Brexit and, you know, you really thought that might have been a unifying factor for people on that side and they couldn't do it then, I struggle to see why more like.
All right. Oh, we just lost you there, Jack, at the end. But thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. That's all we've got time for. I will be back tomorrow with other guests at 12:15. From all of us here, bye-bye.